Excellent, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Julia Coffin, and I'm a senior associate at the More in Common US office. Today, really grateful to be joined by my colleagues Coco, Emily Gurdon, and Ben Bauman. Over the past 2 years, More in Common has been conducting research to really better understand how polarization in America is impacting Americans of faith, including evangelicals, mainline Protestants, Catholics, Latter-day Saints, and Muslim and Jewish Americans. We compiled insights from the research into our newest report, Promising Revelations, which helps shed light on false assumptions about faith communities in America and explores how these misperceptions fuel polarization and division. Drawing on surveys and interviews we conducted with more than 6,000 Americans, our study finds significant perception gaps. So a perception gap is the disparity between what Americans imagine people of faith to believe versus what they actually believe. And so today we're really excited and grateful for your attendance to kind of take a deep dive into the misperceptions surrounding Christians in America specifically, and explore the unifying role that faith can play in help bringing us back together. So Coco, if you could share screen, I can help introduce the presenters that we're joined by today. We're really excited and grateful to be hosting today's presentation and discussion in collaboration with some really wonderful partners and panelists. So especially excited to be joined today by Michael Weir and Phebe Meyer from the Center for Christianity and Public Life, who have both been just really valuable thought partners throughout our entire research project and the insights that we'll share today. Michael is the founder and president of the Center for Christianity and Public Life, CCPL, and has been a trusted advisor on faith and public life for over 15 years. If you haven't already, would encourage you all to check out his newest book, The Spirit of Our Politics, which offers some really thoughtful reflections on how spiritual formation shapes our political life. Phebe serves as the chief of staff at CCPL, where she helps shape the organization's strategy and structure, bringing a wealth of experience and expertise, establishing partnerships between unlikely allies to help promote the common good. And so both Phebe and Michael will help frame and conclude today's presentation, really drawing on their unique insights into the intersection between Christianity, politics, and public life, and offering a vision of what it could become. We're also really grateful to be joined by 3 panelists today whose thought leadership and storytelling and ministry is really helping to reimagine and revitalize the role of Christianity in America. So we're joined by Katie McGray, who's an award-winning author, speaker, and host of the Katie McGray Show on SiriusXM's Catholic channel, which explores pop culture, current events, Catholic news, and how to live a life of abundant joy. We're also joined by Pastor Tyler Burns, who's president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective, the host of Pass the Mic podcast, and as you'll see, a really dynamic speaker, writer, and lead pastor at Rise City Church. And then lastly, really excited to be joined by Pastor Steve Besner, who's the pastor of Houston Northwest Church, where he's served since 2013. Throughout his career, he's been deeply involved in helping to start churches, coach church planters, and support bridge building efforts between Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities. And rumor has it, according to what I found online, he also just published his first book, Your Jesus is Too American, earlier this month. So a huge congrats, and you all should check it out. So just really excited for their expertise and wisdom today, and they're going to be drawing on their deep experience and personal faith to reflect on the report's findings and share insights on the role that Christian communities and leaders have and can play in bringing the country back together. Wonderful. So here is the agenda that we have for the next 90 minutes. We are going to start with some brief introductions by both More in Common and Michael at the Center at CCPL to help kind of set the stage and highlight the stakes. Then I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Coco, who's going to take about 25 minutes to present some key findings from the research, focusing on 3 major misperceptions of Christians in America, the consequences of those misperceptions, and the shared values that could potentially bring us back together. Then we're going to pivot to a panel discussion where we're really excited to welcome Katie, Pastor Tyler, and Pastor Steve for a reflection and discussion of the implications of some of the findings that came out in our research. Then we'll pass it back to CCPL for some final thoughts and reflections before pivoting to some time at the end for a Q&A with you all. We have a block of time dedicated at the end, but if any questions, comments, feedback comes up throughout the presentation, please feel free to post your questions to the Q&A or to the chat, and we'll be kind of monitoring and responding to those live as well. So just a few words about More in Common before we dive into the meat of the agenda. For those who we haven't met, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit research and civic organization. So our mission is to really better understand the forces that are driving Americans apart, to help find common ground, and to bring people together to tackle shared challenges. We're perhaps best well known for our 2018 Hidden Tribe study, which introduced the term the exhausted majority, which refers to the majority of Americans who are fed up with polarization, who hold more flexible and nuanced views, and who believe that common ground can still be found despite this atmosphere of deepening divides. In all of our research, we really aim to understand the complexities and nuances of Americans' attitudes and beliefs. And we really focus on identifying shared values, inspiring narratives, and pathways that can help us collectively overcome toxic polarization and foster more united, inclusive, and resilient communities. My favorite part of this work is we don't do it alone. So we collaborate closely with a wide range of partners across civil society, politics, government, business, faith, education, philanthropy, and media, including the wonderful folks at CPL. And I just want to say, before I pass it off to Michael, just one kind of final word about why we conducted a research on misperceptions of faith community in this moment over the past 2 years. I think over the past few years, our conversations with partners and faith leaders really revealed a shared frustration. Public discourse about faith is increasingly narrow. So media coverage often portrays faith communities as either highly politicized, defined by partisan conflict and extremism, or communities that are shrinking in size and slowly fading into irrelevance. And while these narratives certainly hold some truth, they don't capture the full picture of what it means to be to be a person of faith in America today. So we conducted this research to really help disentangle the complex relationship between politics and religion, to help uncover misperceptions of major faith traditions in the US, and also to help elevate the voices, stories, and experiences of Christians, Jewish, and Muslim Americans, along with those Americans with no religious affiliation. Identifying and addressing these misperceptions really matters because there is no single solution to polarization. To help disrupt the toxic polarization we're experiencing and build stronger bridges, we really need to start in our local communities, in the workplaces, in the schools, in the social groups, but also in the churches, the synagogues, and the mosques where millions of Americans are gathering each week. And so we think that through identifying and correcting these misperceptions, we can begin to reimagine the vibrant role that faith communities can play in helping us navigate division and building stronger communities, which CCPL does so well. So have been really grateful to collaborate with their team at different stages in the project, just for their thought expertise. As Michael will describe in a minute, that the Center for Christianity and Public Life is a nonpartisan organization really dedicated to fostering deeper understandings of how Christianity can positively influence public life and the common good. So I've been really grateful for your support, and I'll pass it off to you, Michael, to offer some opening remarks and context.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I'll be relatively brief because I know you all want to get to the research, and so do we. That's why we're hosting this event. We think this research is just incredibly important. We're grateful to More in Common. We really have a sense of both shared affection and a mutual sense of mission with More in Common. And so it's just been wonderful to partner in this way. I'm also excited that for our panelists who are just leaders I respect a great deal, who I think will bring a great deal of knowledge to unpacking and exploring how this data and research applies to their work and what they're seeing. And so excited to hear from them. We do think at CCPL that Christian leaders don't just offer a sort of religious perspective, but they offer knowledge that's fit for public consideration. And these three panelists are exemplars of that. I just really want to share one thought regarding this research before you hear more about it. And that is, as Christians, we have all of the resources to deal with reality as it is. And so that means that we can tell the truth. And I think there have been times and contexts, even today, where it's been important to assert that Christians need to tell the truth about what is going wrong, about negative things that are taking place even within our own communities. And that's absolutely vital. But what we also think, given our comfort with reality as it is that we ought not tell a more negative story than is reflected in reality. We ought not let the merchants of conflict and antagonism unduly dominate the story of religion and faith in America. And this research, I think, is just a tremendous gift to us, to the public, in understanding the contours of faith in the lives of individual people, but especially the way that faith is interacting and the role that faith plays in public life. I think you're going to learn quite a bit about the facts on the ground. You're going to learn, I think, new ways of telling the story of how faith is operating in American life in a way that will help us to be truth tellers in a more fulsome way. And so I'm excited again to share with you this research. CCPL is proud to partner with More in Common in this way. And we hope that this webinar will be useful to you in the work that you do, both within Christian communities, but also in the broader communities in which you serve and work. And so thank you, Julia. Thank you, Coco. Thank you, Benjamin. I'm excited to learn more, even more than I already know about this tremendous research. Thank you for being with us.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate those words and your partnership. So with that, excited to dig into the meat of the webinar. So I'll pass it off to my colleague, Coco, who will dive into the research.
Sounds good. Thank you, Julia and Michael, for those wonderful introductions. And hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Coco Xu. I'm a researcher at More in Common and one of the lead authors of the report Promising Revelations. I'm very excited to share with you some of our findings, particularly related to Christians, and also eager to hear your thoughts and answer any questions you may have. Just very quickly, before we dive into the data, a few words on the methodology. The report is based on mixed methods research study, where we have 2 nationally representative surveys and 18 focus groups. The first survey was conducted September last year with over 4,200 US adults and additional oversamples from Jewish, Muslim, and Latter-day Saint communities. Then we conducted 18 focus groups, drawing from subgroups within each faith tradition. So for example, we had focus groups with Hispanic Catholics, Black Christians, or conservative evangelicals to get at the different perspectives and experiences and opinions of different Americans across the country. Then we followed up with the second nationally representative survey conducted earlier this year. All right, so let's dive into the data. As Julia set this up, talking about why misperceptions are important to address, one of the ways that we could understand what is driving polarization is to look at where there are large misperceptions. And the way we uncover misperception is through measuring what we call perception gaps. So essentially, a perception gap is the difference between what we imagine a group believes in versus what people in that group actually believe in. And under that framework of perception gap, our research identified 3 key sets of misperceptions or perception gaps. These are the 3 big myths that are preventing us, our church communities, from playing a much greater role in overcoming divisions. And the first myth is that America has come to see faith, especially Christian faith, largely through the lens of politics. And this is especially true for evangelicals. And as some of you might know, that's also one of the reasons why some choose not to use the term evangelical to describe themselves, because how it is politicized, that label has been politicized in public discourse. And this tendency to view faith communities, especially Christian communities, primarily through a partisan or political lens is visible on social media. Here we analyze the words most commonly paired with evangelicals on social media platforms in the past 2 years. And as you can see, most words associated with evangelical Christians are actually quite political, with words such as Trump, Republican, conservative featured most prominently. Far fewer posts and discussions about evangelical Christians have to do with the daily lives of Christians in America, or even matters of theology or religious observations. Our research found that in this context of politicizing Christian communities, Americans often have huge perception gaps when it comes to evangelicals. In our surveys, we ask evangelicals, what is your most important identity? Is it politics? Is it being Christian? Is it your family, your job, etc.? We found that only 4% of evangelicals say being a Republican or a Democrat is their most important identity. However, if we look at the darker purple dot here, which shows non-evangelicals think that over 40% of evangelicals would say political party affiliation is their most important identity, which is 10 times more than the reality. And if we look at the second item, you can see that only 1 in 5 evangelicals believes that being a good Christian means supporting the Republican Party. But most Americans imagine the number is 3 times that. And when it comes to Catholics, we actually see a smaller but similar effect. Non-Catholics imagine Catholics are 4 times as likely as in reality to put their political identity first. When we see that also around 1 in 5 Catholics agree that being a good Christian means supporting the Republican Party, but non-Catholics estimate that 40% of Catholics would agree. So almost double the amount in reality. For mainline Protestants, we find that only 9% of mainline Protestants say that they turn to their faith to advance social and political causes. However, the American public at large imagines that almost half of mainline Protestants do so. In reality, political causes are not the main motivations for why people turn to their faith. Our research found that most Americans turn to their faith or their faith communities to first deepen their relationship with God and to find comfort during difficult times. And less than 1 in 10 Americans actually turn to their faith to express their political views or to advance political causes that they care about. And when it comes to what is our most important identity, we found that most evangelicals say being Christian is their most important identity. It's almost 6 in 10 say so. And as we mentioned earlier, only 4% choose political party affiliation as their most important identity. For Catholics, most prioritize their family role, their American identity, over their political party affiliation. And all these perception gaps, which are the strongest around evangelicals, do matter. We found that the more Democrats and independents overestimate the percentage of evangelicals who are Republican, the more negatively they feel towards all evangelicals. Essentially, the bigger your perception gap, the more you dislike evangelicals. And what this means is that animosity from Democrats and independents that's directed towards Republicans is also sort of misdirected towards all who identify as evangelical because of this perceived association between evangelicals and the Republican Party. We call this phenomena collateral contempt, which is the tendency for animosity or contempt towards political opponents to spill over to religious groups that are perceived to be aligned with one political team. And as you can see on the left-hand side in the chart, this is a linear relationship. We actually also see similar dynamics of collateral contempt when it comes to Catholics. The larger the perception gap, or the more Democrats overestimate the percentage of evangelicals who are Republican, the more they dislike Catholics. This is particularly relevant as there's increasing media attention on conservative Catholics because of J.D. Vance's candidacy for the vice president. And this increased attention on conservative Catholics may lead to more people broadly associating Catholics with political conservatism, which really overlooks the ideological diversity of Catholics in America. And these associations might increase the risk of collateral contempt, where hostility arises due to these perceived political affiliations, as opposed to actual beliefs or practices. So the insight is this: in our polarized age, people too often allow politics to shape the way we view each other, when for most Americans, our political identity is simply not the most important part of who we are. The second myth about Christians and about Americans of faith in general is the story of religion being in decline. But at the same time, while the rise of the religious nuns is there and it is true, we also significantly underestimate the importance of faith to fellow Americans, especially to young people. When we ask how important is being Christian, Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, etc. to you, 73% of Americans say that their faith identity is an important part of who they are. This includes over 9 in 10 evangelical Christians and around 7 in 10 mainline Protestants and Catholics. So overwhelming majority of Americans and Christians. And you may be thinking, what about the generational gap? Is the decline driven by young people turning away from religion? And what we found is it's not true. Around 2/3 of Gen Z still say that their faith is important to them, which is only less than 10% lower than what baby boomers, the percentage of baby boomers who say faith is important to who they are. So this generational gap that we often hear from the media can be overplayed. And in fact, speaking of Gen Z, we found that Gen Z are actually more likely than any other group to say that they turn to their faith to feel a sense of belonging and to be part of a community. This could be because that young people often have the lowest sense of belonging and the weakest networks of relationship out of many different age groups. And this actually points to the opportunities that faith can evolve to adapt to these new needs from the younger generation. And this is really important to think about, especially when we talk about the epidemic of loneliness and the future of faith. As some places of worship grapple with declining service attendance, what they can offer to young people is not only spiritual connection and guidance, but also opportunity to experience belonging in a community. And that's especially urgent to address because if young people are not finding belonging in faith community, they will try to look for that sense of belonging elsewhere. And there are places such as on social media where the sense of belonging is not based on shared values, but shared threat or hatred or antagonism towards other groups. And the insight from this section is that there is decline in religiosity in the past few decades, but the pews are not empty, and the US is still a much more religious nation than we assume, and much more religious than any other Western democracy. The third myth that we found is around religious intolerance. In public discourse about religion in public life, we see that faith is often associated with fundamentalism and intolerance. For example, when we ask an online panel of around 100 Americans this question, what comes to mind when you see the term evangelical Christians? A lot of people use words such as narrow-minded, Christian nationalists. And these are we see a lot of negative views because they associate people of faith with the most extreme version that they can imagine. But in reality, these perceptions are far from the truth. We found that around 8 in 10 Christians across different groups want the US to be a place where people of all religions feel that they belong. And if you look at the light gray bars here, we see that only 5% of evangelicals and even fewer among mainline Protestants and Catholics reject this version of pluralism. But once again, we find large perception gaps between these actual beliefs or actual support for pluralism among Christians and others' perceptions of their beliefs. Americans think that only half of evangelicals would support pluralism, when in reality, the majority of evangelicals are supportive. And in addition to being supportive of pluralism in theory, we found that 3/4 of Americans, including the majority across all Christian groups, are also open to interacting with someone from a different religious background and building personal relationships from there. And what these tell us is that it's important to address these misperceptions because entrenched assumptions about the intolerance of a particular religious community, the harder it is to build trust and connection between different groups. So knowing that there's common support for pluralism among Americans of both majority and minority faith groups can open more doors and interests for interfaith engagement between Christians and non-Christians. And in addition to that, I want to make 2 quick points on why we need to correct misperceptions. The first is that we found a remarkably high percentage of Americans who feel under attack today. And this sentiment of fear and threats is particularly salient among evangelicals. Here we see that around 2/3 of evangelicals feel that their religion is under attack in America. Over 2/3 say feel judged more than others and misrepresented by political and media elites. The reason why we flag this data is that social psychology literature tells us when people feel under attack or when they feel threatened, it's hard for them to engage with others outside of their groups in healthy or constructive ways. Therefore, it is urgent to reduce people's perception of threats. And one way to do so is through countering misperceptions that make people feel under attack and building healthy communities where people can better connect with one another across lines of differences. Another reason why we should correct misperceptions is it's because for individuals to feel respected and valued, they must first feel understood. Our research found that many Christians, regardless of their political affiliation or other demographic differences, they want to be seen as who they are, and they want to see more positive stories about their faith. So for example, here we see on the left-hand side, Delaney, who's an evangelical Christian and a conservative Republican from Georgia. We can actually hear from her.
There's, I guess, a lot of people who think that Christians are hateful. Like everyone else was saying, how we don't accept people because of their sins, but we are sinful ourselves. We don't think that we're perfect. We are not self-righteous. And I think that gets confused where people think that we're pushing religion and Christ onto them. But in reality, like, if you have good news, you want to share it, you know, but it's just not always accepted in a loving way. And so I think that's the biggest misconception.
And on the right-hand side, we can hear from Jonathan, who's a non-evangelical Protestant from North Carolina.
More, it seems like the media only portrays like the negative things that may occur. If someone was found stealing money or something like that. But it would be good that if the media, even the local media, would promote some of the good things that the local churches do, whether it's, like local food drives or, giving kids scholarships to attend college. Because
And as we can hear from these research participants, people are yearning to feel misunderstood and they want to see more positive stories out there. And when people feel that they are seen as who they are, it creates this possibility for greater connections and stronger resilience against polarization. So far, we've looked at what misperceptions are out there about Christians. Why is it important to address these misperceptions? Then the next question is, how should we correct misperceptions? First of all, understanding what drives misperceptions may provide parts of the answer to how we can correct these wrong assumptions. Our research found that the more liberal you are, the more likely you may have a bigger misperception about evangelicals and Catholics. Moreover, the more a person spends time on social media, the bigger their perception gap. These factors show that perhaps targeting liberal-leaning folks, especially those who get their information about evangelicals, not from personal relationships, but from social media, targeting these folks might allow us to most efficiently and effectively correct the misperceptions people have about evangelicals and Catholics. Second, elevating common ground across different religious groups can also strengthen our resilience against efforts to divide communities and stir up conflict. Our research found that most Americans highly value kindness and respect for human dignity. These are all important starting points for us to emphasize the commonality that we all share across groups, regardless of our religious background. Lastly, elevating a diverse range of evangelical and Catholic voices to greater prominence, especially those that run counter to common assumptions, may help correct misperceptions. Here's just some example. So on the left-hand side, we hear from Douglas, a very conservative Republican from Georgia, who shares that God is above our political divisions.
God's welcoming of all different, people of all political beliefs. And he's not just, doesn't just love Republicans or doesn't just love Democrats or any other political party. So.
And on the right-hand side, we have a quote from Melissa, an evangelical woman from North Carolina, who wants to acknowledge the influence of Christianity on the history of America, but she also emphasizes that you don't need to be Christian to be American. And our past research done by More in Common shows that showing these personal stories and voices are actually often more effective than statistics and more effective in changing people's minds. So in order to correct misperceptions, it is crucially important to elevate these personal stories. And the last point I want to make is that our research found that around half of Americans in our churches are looking for guidance from their leaders on how to navigate political division, how to talk to people whose views are different from them, and how to navigate cultural changes in their local communities. So what this means is that it shows us there is a real potential for faith leadership and faith communities to help guide people through these our deeply divided times and to mitigate polarization outside of our churches. And the way we can do that is to first correct misperceptions, because that by doing that, we can unlock the potential where we see faith as a solution as opposed to a driver of polarization. And this is also why the work of CCPL and the panelists we have here today can be so valuable. And with that, I'll pass it over to Julia for our panel discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Coco. Really appreciate you walking us through some of the key findings from the research. Excited to pivot us now to a panel discussion. We'll take about 20 minutes. Really excited for Pastor Steve, Katie, and Pastor Tyler to kind of walk us through or to help us kind of process and reflect on what we just heard, while also stretching our imagination around the role that faith leaders and faith communities can play in helping us move forward. So really grateful for all three of you to be joining us today. I'll wait one moment as Ben, thank you, Ben, for spotlighting all three of our panelists so that you can make sure everybody's on your screen. But just again, as I mentioned in the beginning, really appreciative of all three of you and just your leadership and your storytelling and your ministry and the role that's really playing right now and helping us reimagine and revitalize the role of Christianity in America today. So looking forward to learning from you all. I have many questions, so I'm going to dive right in. But for those on the call, if you guys have questions you want me to ask the panelists as well, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we can be sure to surface those at the Q&A. So welcome all. To start us off, as Coco shared in her presentation, the research really surfaced three key misperceptions. So that Christians are driven by politics, that faith is becoming increasingly irrelevant, and that faith communities are intolerant. Curious how, if at all, have these misperceptions impacted you or the faith communities that you're a part of? Does anyone want to start us off? I don't want to call you out, but feel free to chime in.
I mean, I'll speak to, excuse me, the fact that I think one of the misperceptions is faith is largely irrelevant. And I think people of faith hear that and we're like, but it's the most relevant thing in my life. And it's kind of amusing that other people assume it's irrelevant, and yet they're being asked, do you think Christianity is relevant? And then they're offering an insight that, well, it's not, and yet they've just been asked a question about its relevance. So I think it kind of proves its relevance. And maybe that's talking in a circle here, but I was on a webinar last night of Catholics, a completely voluntary Tuesday evening thing where we're continuing to dive into Catholics in the United States of America are in the midst of a Eucharistic revival right now. Tuesday night, 7 p.m., we had about 4,000 people signed up for this thing, and a couple thousand showed up. And it had about a week and a half of notice. And it was a completely like, this is not a Sunday obligation. This is not a holy day of obligation. The Pope didn't tell us we had to be there. It was a voluntary thing to listen to a woman speak about faith. And so the misperception that, well, Catholics don't show up to stuff, or Catholics don't care about stuff, or, I mean, I think we would say, but it's incredibly relevant to our lives. And maybe it's a branding problem. Maybe we're just not telling people about the relevance in our lives. And I'd be interested to see, what Pastor Tyler and Pastor Steve have to say about in their communities. Are their people still showing up? And we just aren't necessarily telling people that we're still showing up. And maybe it just requires, not that this is all about finding solutions, but for Christians to be a little more bold in the way that we showcase that is still very relevant in our lives.
I think that's a great insight. Katie, I really agree with everything that you just said. I would also say that the misconception that said that faith and politics are uber intertwined, I've just found not to be the case at least in my congregation. Don't get me wrong, there's certainly people that have political preferences and political opinions, but I think that one of the things that has been refreshing for me is to discover that while people in my congregation are certainly active civically and they have strong opinions regarding politics, what they really want to know how to do is how to follow Jesus faithfully in public. And so then they take that insight and try then to apply that to the political realm, but politics are not driving their faith. And so I think that, back to what you were saying, people are still showing up, and I find that they're showing up not for political insights, but rather for how to faithfully follow Jesus, because they've discovered that following Jesus is the most meaningful thing in their lives.
Yeah, I appreciate both of my panelists and esteemed colleagues' comments, and also Julie and Coco and your team for your research. It's funny, our church, I have both a national perspective as a leader of an organization, then also a local church pastor as well. And so our church went through a pretty seismic shift in January, where we were kind of 95% Black, and shifted pretty much in a week. That's a long story, but shifted in a week to having a multi-ethnic congregation, now about 65-35 Black and white. And so that's been very interesting and intriguing. We also went through a seismic shift over the last 18 months of the average age of the church was 55 plus. Now it's 27. So as we navigated this, I reflexively braced myself for the shift within the context of a 2024 election cycle, being a Black-led church that merged into kind of a multi-ethnic context, or multi-ethnic context merged into us, and also younger political voices or younger people in the space. And what I have found is, I don't know if this is the right way for me to say it, but we have given the media a lot of credit where they don't deserve it. And I have not found that it has been as hard as I expected for people to navigate life together. I've actually found like they've been intrigued by the possibility of a community they didn't think could exist. And much like Pastor Steve said, we have people of a broad range of political opinions now, and definitely are strongly entrenched in what they would believe in terms of convictions. But I have not seen that play itself out in the context of community. I haven't seen that lead to the questioning of one another. And I think that's because it's really hard to hold stereotypes about people you're in relationship with. And when you're in relationship with people, it's hard to hate them. You just grow to love them due to proximity. And so I found that, sure, those narratives may be effective, but they're not by any means omnipotent.
Wonderful. Thank you all for sharing that. And yeah, I appreciate in particular those final reflections, Tyler. And I imagine, yes, some of that certainly comes from the relationship building that happens in your congregation. I'm sure some of it is also a credit to your leadership. So I wouldn't be surprised if you got a flood of emails after this being like, how are you managing that? And it's wonderful to hear it's successful.
My answer is, I don't know. It's God and grace. That's pretty much it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just appreciate your reflections. I want to tug a little bit on what you shared, Katie, as well as Tyler, I think, but it sounds like you're navigating as well right now. So as we mentioned, kind of, as you allude to, Katie, one of the notions, or one of the myths the report is kind of challenging, is the notion that faith is becoming less relevant. And as we've heard from all of you, it's incredibly relevant and vibrant in your lives and in the lives of the communities that you're a part of. But we're hearing it's also especially relevant for younger generations. Curious how you think about the relevance of Christianity in Christian institutions in modern American life, particularly for young people, and what changes, if any, do you think faith communities should embrace to help people wrestle with the kind of spiritual and moral questions they're facing today?
I got my start in ministry as a youth minister. So I spent the majority of I think a lot of people who work in church work were youth group kids who just kept hanging out at youth group. And then we became the leaders. And I'm always fascinated by the fact that, there's nothing new under the sun. The things that I was dealing with in the early 2000s as a teen, I mean, I remember going to Bible study the Sunday after 9/11, and it was my youth minister who was helping our group process what we had watched play out on the news. And then I found myself as a youth minister working with young people during 2016 in an incredibly volatile presidential election cycle. And here I was a decade and a half later, and we're still having conversations about how to process big news and how to process seemingly seismic shifts. And so I think young people seek out the church and they seek out leaders in the church because they find, as we know this to be true, a non-judgmental group of people who are willing to talk about the hard things. And yet from the outside looking in, people just kind of assume we're shoving an ideology down their throat, or that we're sitting there thinking we're holier than thou and we're better than everybody else, when actually I find people in the church, especially with young people, to be the ones who are most willing to wrestle and to grapple. I think we've all gone through crises of faith. And when I was a teenager and walking that road of, I don't know if I believe any of this, it was a deacon in the Catholic Church who looked at me and said, if you don't ask questions, the church doesn't have the opportunity to answer. And I think that's a lot of Christians who are saying, no, to young people, we know that you're worried about morality. We know that you're worried about the way we talk about each other in society, or how seemingly divided things might be, other than for that hour and a half on Sunday when we're all together. But like, we can talk about that here. And so young people find a stability there, and something that's lasting and not as fleeting and as quickly satisfying as what the rest of the world has to offer them. The other big thing that we're seeing in the Catholic Church right now, especially with young people, is college campus ministry, especially driven through an organization called Focus, Fellowship of Catholic University Students, that provides like just basic community. Hey, come for a Bible study. Hey, we have a meal on Wednesdays. It's free lunch. You don't have to come to mass first. Like, just come get a free meal and sit in a place. Around the corner from my house is the university in my hometown, and the Catholic campus ministry sells parking spots. And so it's like the cheapest place to park on campus. And you just happen to be in close proximity to a place where you can hang out and get a free meal once a week and go and study. And so like, these young people are gravitating towards just simple ways that community can be found, and then finding, oh, I do belong here. And that's incredibly refreshing. And yes, there are at times polarizing moments. And there was a kerfuffle not long ago. I was talking to a youth minister friend of mine. A kid wore a Trump shirt to a Bible study and was super offensive to a kid who was in there saying, he wants to deport my family. And it kind of broke out into a conversation where there was perceived hurt and there was established belief. And yet it was in that youth group that they were able to have that conversation. And so I think when we can advertise and promote and share that, then I love the collateral contempt phrase, it lessens a bit. And I found that young people are actually gravitating to church because of the stability it provides.
Well, first say, Katie, I'm going to steal that idea about the parking spots. That's a tremendous idea. I'm stealing that. But even beyond that, also growing up in my start in ministry I was youth pastor for 10 years before taking over the church. And what was fascinating for me is how many of them just needed space to process and just needed space to float an idea without judgment or ask a question without immediately being shut down. And now as a lead pastor, what I found is we can't deny that for many Gen Z Christians, millennial Christians, they've had negative experiences with the institutional church and felt as though they were shunned or felt as though they were put to the side. We can't deny that. And what I found, though, is that the vast majority of why they left said church after or in a moment of conflict was because they did not feel like there were spaces for them to actually have accessible leaders to process what just happened. And there was also not a space for repentance and not a space for an honest accountability of the hurt that they experienced. And so what I found is what's crucial for faith leaders is to create spaces of honest accountability and responsibility. Also the space to every 6 to 8 weeks or so, we have something during our service. So this won't be something after the service, but after I preach, we'll have an open Q&A so people can text in questions on really anything. And it was crucial for us to start this mainly because it's important for Gen Z Christians to see their pastor not be defensive, especially when given a hard question. And so I think when people see a lack of patience from us as leaders in handling hard questions and contentious issues, I think what they find is they feel a little bit more off-put to be able to bring those in the Christian community. But where there is space for them to ask honest questions and be heard, and also the honesty to say, we're wrestling with that. We're working through that. And there's a lot of different spaces, a lot of different opinions, even within this space. I found that they've gravitated towards it. And then the final thing I'll say is it seems odd, but I'm a church boy through and through. And if you can study your scripture together, and if you can sit in community in a circle or a table, we are addicted to mass produced faith gatherings, specifically in the Protestant Christian side. And we are addicted to church in a box, making it as fancy as possible. And I'm not saying none of that matters. What I am saying is what I have found to be particularly effective is not Sunday morning for us, it's Wednesday night. And when people can sit across from each other at tables or in circles, eat a good meal, study the scriptures or curriculum together, I have found that to be wildly more effective than anything else. And I found that Gen Z actually desires to be a part of it.
Thank you both. Pastor Steve, do you have anything you want to add? There's no pressure to. I didn't want to pivot in case you wanted to chime in. But.
No, I would just add, post-COVID lockdowns of 2020, we the fastest growing group in our church has been Gen Z and millennials. And I think that has been a response to Gen Z and millennials discovering and recognizing firsthand that a disembodied existence is not optimal. And I think I would simply just agree with both Katie and Pastor Tyler in the sense that the Gen Z and millennials in our community have shown up and said, I want a place where I can sit with others, often not just people in their own age bracket, to learn from, to be mentored, to ask hard questions. And I think that just offering an embodied space to be with other people where they are accepted and loved has been something that's really, really resonated. I might just add on to that one thing that both Katie and Pastor Tyler mentioned were just spaces to ask questions. And I think that we've tried to do that as well. And so it sounds like maybe that's a common thread, whether that's live or on social media or whatever. But Tyler's insight that not being defensive is one of the most important things that our people want to see, I truly believe is accurate.
Thank you. I really appreciate your thoughtful responses to that question. And as all three of you are speaking, I was really struck by so much of what we were talking about are like youth groups and churches being a space where Gen Z can really learn and practice the skills, right, that are needed to live in a diverse and complicated and nuanced society. And they're skills that youth are not always learning elsewhere. And so just the kind of the critical importance of that and the role that you all are playing in helping kids kind of navigate that is really wonderful. I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit to this idea of collateral contempt. So as Coco shared in the presentation, one of the major findings in the report regarding evangelicals and Catholics in particular was this concept of collateral contempt, where partisan animosity spills over to these two religious communities because of their perceived affiliation with one political party. We understand you will not have all of the answers, but would love to hear your thoughts on how you see this dynamic, if at all, playing out in your community, and if there are any, but you think potential solutions to kind of push back on that collateral contempt might look like, or maybe that you've tried.
I'd love to tell a story if that would be okay. So our church campus was flooded by Hurricane Harvey in 2017. The community surrounding our church building was under 6 feet of water. And so we mobilized the congregation to do what many other congregations in the Houston area did, which was to engage in just cleanup. So push what's called mudding out houses, pushing out dirt and mud and ripping out drywall so that mold doesn't grow in homes afterwards. In the wake of the Pulse nightclub shooting, we decided to build an intentional relationship with the mosque that is near our church. And we did that because we began to recognize that there was collateral contempt towards the Muslim community in our part of the city in the wake of that. And of course, that I think really started after 9/11. So whenever we were doing cleanup in the neighborhood, one of the things that our people were just on the lookout for were to specifically help people in our community who they recognized were Muslim, because they knew that there would probably be some stigma associated with that. And so one of my favorite stories from that moment was there was a senior adult man from my congregation who was in the grocery store, and he saw a woman wearing a hijab who was buying some supplies that led him to deduce that their house had been flooded and that she was needing to clean out. And so he approached the woman, said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I know you have your children with you, but I saw what you were purchasing. I'm with the church and I wanted to see if you needed help cleaning out your house." To which she said, "Oh, thank you so much. But some people from a church called Houston Northwest, which is our church, have already been to our house and already cleaned it out. And by the way, I had no idea that Christians were like this. I think if people knew that Christians thought like this, everyone would want to be a Christian." So that is, to me, the distilled example of how collateral contempt can shift in an instance. And it always shifts back towards proximity and relationship. And I think that whenever we choose to serve the people that we are tempted to believe are our natural enemies, we end up discovering that we have more in common. One of my favorite things out of my friendship with the imam at the local mosque was to discover his complaints about his congregation were very similar to the complaints I have about my congregation. He would say, they only want to come at Ramadan, that kind of a thing, which made me laugh and sounded like us talking about Easter and Christmas. And so I just think that relationship is the way to discover common ground and to eliminate collateral contempt.
I love that. As you were talking about the imam and the hijab, I was reminded of Pope Francis's recent visit to Southeastern Asia. And literally he did an event with the imam at one of the largest mosques in the world. And there's a bridge that has been built underground between the Catholic cathedral and the mosque. And it's literally called the Bridge of Friendship. And Catholics were thrilled about it. And then, of course, some of the rest of the world was then calling Pope Francis a heretic for doing it. And then, of course, then you see the pictures of Pope John Paul II kissing the Quran, or Pope Benedict XVI standing alongside Muslim leaders. And there's this narrative that even Catholics will sometimes shove in the face of others that, well, our only interest is to convert people into our religion, when actually our interest is to introduce people to Jesus Christ and to stand alongside people in their attempts to understand and learn truth. And even Catholics themselves are sometimes not very good at articulating that. But yet when we get to the head honcho, he's actually very interested in articulating that. And I love that story, Pastor Steve. You mentioned Hurricane Harvey. And I also thought of Hurricanes Laura and Delta, which hit Lake Charles just a couple of hours away in 2020. And the first people on the ground were Catholic Charities. And they tried to make it as widely known as possible. And our Catholic Charities office is run by the Religious Sisters of Mercy, who are habited religious sisters, many of whom have advanced degrees. So we have two of our religious sisters here in town are PhDs, one in sociology, one in education. So these are highly educated women who are wearing medieval outfits that make them look maybe a little unapproachable to people who don't know them. And they did a radio campaign to let people know Catholic Charities is ready to serve, not because you're Catholic, but because we're Catholic. We're ready to serve because this is the gospel mandate. And it immediately became, this is a place where people can go before, during, and after these tragedies. And I think that when Christians work from a place of service, like you said, then people all of a sudden their guard lessens and they realize we're not just grabbing Bibles and thumping them over the head with it, but we know that scripture, we know those teachings, and that's what's leading us to that relationship. But that's not what the media often carries, or what the social media world always wants to advertise, because it doesn't get clicks. And I think it was Coco who said the contempt machine that is often driven in the media world would rather us all be against one another because that gets views. I collaborate with CNN at times and they ask me to comment on stories, generally like, let's figure out what Pope Francis really meant when he said what he said, as an 80-something Argentinian man who sometimes doesn't maybe say it the most clearly. And it's never the positive stuff that he says that they want to talk about. We were on the hook for about 24 hours when Pope Francis met with all of the comedians in June. And, he's shaking hands with Mike Birbiglia and Jimmy Fallon and Stephen Colbert, and they didn't want to carry that story. That story got bumped because Princess Kate was coming back out in the public eye the very next day. So the Pope story got bumped, the happy Pope story. But had it been a negative Pope story, had it been the Pope is ill or the Pope said something he shouldn't have said, that would have been headline news. because that, I think they like the collateral contempt. And this is coming from someone who works in the media, but the media wants to run with the contempt because then we can drive people to continue watching. And I don't know how we fight against that other than doing more of what your parish and churches were doing, Pastor Steve, and more of what Catholic Charities is doing, and more of the community building that Pastor Tyler's talking about.
Katie, I just want to add one thing very quickly. What you said reminded me of a slogan that we stole from Bob Roberts, another pastor, but we serve not to convert, we serve because we're converted.
I'm still in that too.
Thank you both. Those are just really very compelling answers, and just appreciate the personal stories you shared as well. And I think that kind of ties nicely to the next thing I've been wondering about. To your point, Katie, is like, what do we do about it? So public, right, perceptions of Christian groups is often shaped by the media or political narratives, and there are some kind of wonky incentives and disingenuous incentives there, right, to drive what content is elevated and what stories are deemed newsworthy. And so wondering, in addition to like the really thoughtful relationship building and that you guys have articulated, what do you think that Christian leaders or Christian communities, what role can they play in reshaping these perceptions and helping the public understand the more nuanced, diverse, and complex dimensions of what it means to be a person of faith in America today? And are there any additional stories you would want to kind of lift up about your faith community?
I think that's a great question. And Julia, what I would say is I really believe that Christian leaders need to have courage in the public square. And fear is a double-edged sword. There is a fear of the other, and otherizing those around us. But then there's also a fear of who we are as well. And what I found is that it's very easy for us in our assumed polarized times to shrink back from being who we are, and to shrink back from being honest about the fact that we are faith leaders. And as silly as it sounds, I think it's easier now to hide than it has been before. And I think the openness to be able to say we have a Christian community that we are striving as best as we can to model what it means to be emotionally healthy, to be caring and considerate of one another, to be compassionate to our neighbors, and to follow the tenets and practices of our faith seems simple, but I think might be a little bit more countercultural than what we know and believe. I also think it's crucial for us to be very strategic about how we build partnership. I love the story that Pastor Steve just told. And the reason I love it is because I was recently in Houston, and I was in Houston for a trip on interfaith engagement. And so I actually went to a mosque, actually spoke with an imam, and went to a number of different faith expressions. And watching people do that on the ground and be strategic about building those relationships in peacetime, not just in times of contentiousness and conflict, not just in 2024, but what's the strategy for post-election to ensure that we're building once everyone has calmed down when they find out the results of the election? How are we building to actually prevent the next major crisis from consuming and drowning the city or the region that we're in, because we built up relationships with those around us who are different from us? I believe it's important for us to have strategic minds, not just bold stances in terms of who we are, in terms of being public about who we are, also not being ashamed of being converted. But I think also it's important for us to have strategy in how we move, and then to also disciple those who are in our parishes or congregations on what it looks like to have strategic partnership relationships with our neighbors, that says, I'm going to go outside of my way, as Pastor Steve was saying, to make sure that I find someone who is different from me and see if there's a way that I can serve them and love them, especially when it's needed. So I think those are things that I would say are crucial and important for us. We often don't think strategically, and we need each other, and we need each other not just when there's time of crisis. We need each other to build up the relationship for that time of crisis.
I would just piggyback on to what Tyler said, and maybe just add and say that we have discovered that serving in the community is the gateway to influence. So if we talk about changing public perception of Christians, I don't know that we ever really have the opportunity to start at the national level, because I can't control what national leaders think or what they say. At the same time, at the hyper local level, congregations can make a massive difference, because if you serve over time, then you will gain influence and impact. And what we've discovered as a congregation, we're a large church, quote unquote, but we're not large for Houston. You know, I'm never going to be Joel Osteen or whatever down the street. But that being said, we found ourselves in rooms with public officials because they've seen our church's heart for the community. And what I've discovered is that if you will faithfully serve and engage with public officials, speaking to Pastor Tyler, referring to thinking strategically, if you'll say, what are the problems that our congregation can help you address? So in our particular instance, that has turned out to be folks who are trying to learn English. So ESL, immigration, mentoring of troubled teens and children, substance abuse, providing counseling opportunities in the community, reaching out to a variety of different groups. So as we do those sorts of things, then we gain influence in the public eye. Not that that's our goal, but they see us as a partner rather than an adversary. And so then that changes perception. And one of my favorite stories that came out of that was one of my friends came to town to guest speak for me. And there's a CVS right next door to our church. And so he walked over there to get some gum or mints or something like that. And he was talking to the young lady who was working the cash register, and just asked her, hey, what do you know about this church that's right next door? And she said, oh, it's an amazing church. And he said, oh, really? Well, why is it an amazing church? And she just started listing all the things that she knew that our church did in the community. And he said, oh, do you go there? And she said, oh, I don't go to church, but if I did need to go to church, that's the church I would go to. And I just thought that if you want to change the public perception of Christianity, we have to change the things that we put our energy towards. And I think that service is the number one thing to do that changes the way that others think about Christians and to eliminate collateral contempt.
That was really, oh yeah, go ahead, Katie.
Well, I mean, I love that. It reminded me of an interaction I had. I was traveling for a parish mission. Catholics love our parish missions, and it was during Lent, because we do all of our stuff during Lent, because those are the 40 days where we're like super Catholic. And I was at this hotel and I was checking in, and it was a small town, and the guy behind the counter asks me why I'm in town. And I was like, oh, I'm doing a parish mission at the church. And like the church was like 15 minutes away. Like this was the closest Marriott to there. And he went, oh, I went to school there. And they had a Catholic school. And so he'd gone to this Catholic school. And so I just asked him, well, do you still go to church at this particular place? And he said, oh, Christmas and Easter. So he's a Creaster Catholic, not all that surprising. He's probably just trying to avoid making his mama cry. And so I invited him to come to the parish mission. And he was like a little wary, because I mean, that's like a real Catholic thing. And we were going to have adoration, and there's going to be confession. And like, we're throwing him right back in the deep end from his little 8th grade experiences. And he didn't come the first night, and he didn't come the second night, but he showed up the third night. And I realized at this point, the parish had this opportunity to like hook him back in. And was somebody going to be around after the fact? And that's not something that Catholics are always really good at, right? Like we'll go to the thing because the thing is good, but then the follow-up or the continued accompaniment or the continued walking, like that's not always our gift. But I alerted the pastor. I told the Monsignor, like, you need to keep an eye on this guy and just be around for him. And they struck up a friendship. They struck up a relationship. They stayed in touch. Eventually, that girl that he came with, they got married at the church and are now like super Catholic. And this is not me saying it's because I invited him to come to the parish mission. It's because the Monsignor stuck around and stayed in that relationship. And so Tyler said that earlier, the best thing's not Sunday, it's the Wednesday night Bible study. And Pastor Steve articulating like, well, if I needed to go to church, that's where I'd go. I think it all boils back down to when you see a person, not as just a project to convert, but as somebody to walk with. And Pope Francis is using this phrase, he's used it for the past 11 years, accompaniment, and actually standing alongside someone and listening to them and really road to Emmausing them, walking along with them, even if it's in the wrong direction. That when Christians do that, even if just one Christian does it with one other Christian, will that pay it forward effect? It unfolds in front of your eyes. That's how the gospel is spread. I think we assume we have to do it on a large scale, a big platform, massive influence. Social media doesn't help that because it people that go viral that talk about it, we just all kind of want to do that. And it's actually no, like the best ministry that any of us do is probably the very localized, direct, right there in front of people. And if just one Christian can change the perspective of one person about what Christian is, and that eventually catches fire, then I think we'll be a lot better. There will be a lot of healing.
Thank you. Really appreciate you all sharing that. And if you look in the chat, you guys are getting echoes and cheers from folks on Zoom in affirmation of what you shared. And I think that just offers some really kind of like concrete and approachable work that we can all do in our daily lives, starting right after this webinar. So just appreciate you outlining and sharing that. I just have one more question because I want to make sure I hold time for folks on who are joining today to ask questions of you and CCPL and Coco as well. But maybe just to end, I think the data that Coco presented suggests that Americans are really looking to Christian leaders for guidance in navigating political and social divides and overcoming toxic polarization. Faith leaders are still highly trusted, which is incredible because we are in a moment in time when Americans have low levels of trust in institutions and leaders across the board. And so that's a really unique and powerful position to be in. And just really appreciated, Tyler, your comment about having courage, because it is a moment where folks are turning to their faith leaders, and you are a source of trust. And how do you kind of make the most of that role and responsibility? So I'd be curious how you've drawn on, I don't know if it's the teachings, the rituals, the texts, or the values of your faith to help bridge divides and build understanding within your community. And are there any lessons that you've learned along the way that could help others on the call today?
Right now, leading up to the election, we're preaching a series on enemy love. And we talked about doing a series on political theology or whatever. And the more that we talked about it, we just said, that's not what our people need. What they need to know is they need to know how to love people who are different from them. And so each week we're looking at a different spiritual practice that the scriptures commend believers to do towards their enemies. So pray for your enemies, bless your enemies, forgive your enemies, etc. And what I've discovered in that is that it's far more effective for helping our people learn how to navigate this political season, as opposed to me saying, whatever kind of political thoughts that I could come up with. And I think that if you teach consistently those sorts of things, whenever it's time to be prophetic, then your people will sit up and listen. One of the things that I find is that sometimes, particularly in the internet age, everybody's looking to flip a table. And I just like to point out that Jesus only did that once, as far as we know. So we can't make that the mainstay of our ministry. There might be a time to flip a table, but most of the time it is compassion, care, patience, and love. And if we do those things, then we can be a faithful witness. And so I just continue to believe that politics and civic engagement matter. We want to build a better world together. At the same time, one of the best things that we can do as faith leaders is build a local community where no matter what is happening in the outside world might feel unstable or unsteady, people see a space where they can go be received and experience goodness and kindness no matter what's happening in the outside world. And I think if we do those things on a consistent basis, then we help our people more than we ever could with any kind of, political advice du jour.
No, that's super helpful, Pastor Steve. I'm a recovering table flipper myself. I'm still in rehab for that. But what's funny is I think I have been navigating what it means to step fully into embracing who I feel like God has called me to be, not just as a pastor, but also as a young man. And what has been comforting for me is the lineage, the heritage of Black leaders and Black pastors, Black Christian pastors who have walked through much, much more polarizing and difficult times than I have. And it has been comforting, if not at sometimes disheartening, to study history and to see that we've been here before. Maybe not at this exact moment, but with this type of contempt and polarization, we've been here before. And what I have found consistently is that the best of the Black Christian tradition teaches us that we are called to love our local community, serve our neighbors, to speak prophetically, but to, as best as possible, not allow what's on the outside to infect what is on the inside. And it has also been, ironically, our stance that every month we want to carve out time for people to actually practically right there on the ground in the middle of service pray for their enemies. So we lead a guided time of them praying for their enemies, to speak very specifically. We'll give out note cards for them to write down names if they need to lay them at the altar, or to keep them in order to make a plan to attempt reconciliation, if it is applicable for them. I found that enemy love in the story of Dr. King, enemy love in the story of Howard Thurman, and in many others has been transformative. So yes, there is this perception of Black Christian preachers being prophetic voices and trumpets for justice, and I believe that is 1000% true, and I stand in that tradition as well. But what I've also found is they were ambidextrous. They were able to speak truth to power, but they were also able to speak truth to people. And by speaking truth to people, they were able to not dehumanize them in the process. And if there's one thing that I think people need to see pastors do very well, and I'll say this in closing, I think people need to see pastors choosing to disagree without dehumanizing other pastors. I've actually found that to be other faith leaders. I've actually found that to be sometimes a little bit more difficult. People we can say, well, they may not know what we know, or they may not have the experience we do, but other pastors or spiritual leaders, I think people need to see us love, speak true, but not dehumanize as well.
As somebody who I'm on the radio for 10 hours a week with a large audience. Our joke is often there's 35 million Sirius XM subscribers. So if 1% are listening to the Catholic channel, we've got a lot of people who are tuning in their cars. And the rule of thumb is people change the channel within about 6 to 7 minutes. So you only have little short snippets of time to try to articulate something true. And earlier this year, I was on we're going to educate and we're going to ensure that our Catholic audience knows the issues, and we're going to bring the headlines to a Catholic perspective. And every day, it didn't matter what I said, somebody misunderstood it or somebody heard it the way that they wanted to hear it, right? One day I was a raging Democrat. One day I was a raging Republican. Somebody thought I was an RFK Jr. person for a little while because I made like one comment about a Kennedy. Like it would, because people only hear it for that little snippet of time. So over the summer, when we had our big National Eucharistic Congress, which was, somebody said earlier, Protestants love to do the big event thing. Catholics don't. And we finally did. And it was actually a success. And we had our version of like a passion conference as Catholics in Lucas Oil Stadium with 50,000 Catholics, the biggest thing that we've done in a very long time. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of concern that was going to become a very politicized event because it was in between the two major party conventions. And the only time the candidates' names were said was in the middle of somebody's talk saying, it doesn't matter at the time if it was Donald or Joe, Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, and he reigns. And at that moment, I just kind of became deeply convicted that as a Catholic, I have one single vote. I have one single radio show. I have 2 little girls that I'm raising. But what I do have is a robust prayer life, and I believe access to spending time with Jesus Christ in the tabernacle. And so my husband and I committed to a holy hour. So once a week on Thursdays at 2 a.m, we split back and forth. So he takes it two nights or 2 Thursdays a month, and I take it the other 2 Thursdays of the month. And we go for an hour. And for us, we believe sitting in front of the presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. And that is the most fruitful thing I can do for our country. It's the most fruitful thing I can do for my family. It's the most fruitful thing I can do for my profession, is actually talking to Jesus. And Catholics are not very good sometimes I've said quite a few times what Catholics are not very good at, but we're not very good, I think, at actually sharing with people like, no, I have a very robust prayer life. I read scripture. I study my catechism. I look at the history of the church. Like those are but all of that combined, when I sit in front of the presence of Jesus, for me, is the most important thing that I can do. And that I think is what changes our culture and our world, is like Catholics, Christians, people who are people of prayer. Like, I believe prayer works. I wouldn't do it if I didn't. Why am I not telling other people that that's the most important thing I'm doing this election cycle? That my holy hour, the Thursday after the election, will be offered for the winner and the loser, because they both are going to need prayer, and our country is absolutely going to need some healing regardless of what occurs. And like, I think if Christians can say, we're not just on a warpath, and we're not just trying to convince people of various things, but we are actually going to our Lord and talking to him. St. Therese of Lisieux says that prayer is a lifting of the heart, a surge of the heart, a lifting of the mind. If I'm allowing my heart to surge towards Jesus, whatever happens on November 5th, I can still wake up November 6th confident that Jesus Christ sits on the throne. And like, I think that is, as a Catholic, the most important thing I could offer right now. And Catholic leaders talking about that, we do pray, and actually telling people that we pray, and like saying that this is an important part of our life. I think that could change some of those misperceptions and actually heal a little bit of our land.
Katie, you got me stirred up. I'm a good
Oh,
Pentecostal.
come on.
You got me
Thursday
stirred
mornings,
up.
2 a.m. We're praying.
2 a.m. Ooh, that sound good to me. I like that.
Yes, completely agree. That was amazing. And just, I think a really beautiful note to end on. That was so powerfully said, Katie. Thank you for that. And just appreciate everyone's time today. My apologies. I totally lost track of time because I was fully engrossed in what all of the panelists were reflecting on and sharing. I think we have time for maybe one question or two questions. I haven't seen much pop up on the chat or in the Q&A box by word of question, but if you have anything that you're sitting with that you're burning to ask any of the panelists, Phoebe from CCPL or Coco from my team, please feel free to drop it in. I saw one kind of comment that could be perceived as a question from Diana earlier on, and she had mentioned in the chat that many Christian community leaders are expressing that the very political members of their congregation have an outsized influence, resulting in others feeling maybe intimidated or fearful, and also mentioned that leaders are kind of like lamenting that highly polarized corners of social media have an outsized influence on their community members as well. I'm seeing some of you nod. Is that a concern that you feel as well? And do you have any advice for someone who might be navigating that?
I would agree with that assessment. And I would say that back to what Tyler was saying earlier, those are the moments where we have to speak prophetically and really push on the notion that politics is the defining factor within the congregation's life. I don't know that confronting individuals on social media is ever really productive in any format, but I do think in the congregation, if you begin to sense that, simply redirecting and recentering exactly what Katie was just saying on Jesus himself and his lordship is what really helps in that moment. So I think that whenever we begin to sense that, which I know that I have, and I'm certain the other two panelists have as well, then we have to recenter.
I think also as I completely agree with what Pastor Steve is saying, and I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that a lot of our congregants are not necessarily trained with how to navigate media misinformation, disinformation, the difference between commentary and news, opinion pieces. They're not trained on how to do this. I think this actually needs to be part of our discipleship. Like part of our discipleship, or the idea of walking alongside people. I believe you said, Katie, it's accompaniment, like walking alongside people needs to be some sort of critical thinking training to know, hey, people are going to try to manipulate your emotions, especially as the election gets closer and closer, specifically with topics, with buzzwords, with catchy ads. You actually need to be trained in how to receive that, but not allow that to become part of your identity, and not allow that to be a driver of your emotions. And I think that's a major portion of what is our role as faith leaders, is also that's part of discipleship. And in part of discipleship, we need to make sure that we're training people not just for the spiritual matters, but also for life as well, and how that will intersect with their faith.
Great, thank you, Tyler. And I know Katie, I think, has to run onto the radio, so we'll say goodbye to her now. And I think Ben, you can maybe put us all back on the screen. I'm not seeing any other questions pop up in the Q&A or chat, so I think that's probably a good note to end on. Before we conclude, I just wanted to pass it back to Phoebe at CCPL, because I know your team is thinking so much about how to equip faith leaders and Christians in America more generally on how to meet the moment. And so just wanted to create a little space for you to share any final thoughts or kind of resources that you all could offer.
Thank you, Julia. I so did not want that conversation to end. I could keep listening to you all for probably another hour longer. When I think about the more in common finding that people are actively looking for leaders to listen to on navigating political division in the country, I'm just so grateful for you all, Steve, Tyler, and Katie, and the humble, wise approach that you take to understanding and transcending these divisions. At the Center for Christianity and Public Life, we understand the reasons why so many are cynical about Christianity, about politics, about growing divides in our culture. And yet we also have great hope. And I hope that you all also have great hope after listening to the conversation today. The research that More in Common has done complicates some of the most dominant perceptions about Christianity and public life. And every day at CCPL, we are working alongside individuals who complicate those perceptions too. And so we have joyful confidence in the hope and the resources that Christianity offers because of the positive contributions that we see Christians making on the most pressing issues of the day in their communities, their congregations, and in our politics on every level. I want to just briefly highlight, as Julia mentioned, some of the ways that CCPL is building our vision for healthier politics and public life, and also some ways that you all can get involved with the work that we are doing. As November 5th draws near, just under 2 weeks, we've put together some resources on how to navigate the election with faithfulness and vision. You can go to ccpubliclife.org/2024 to check out these resources. And our wonderful team member, Heather, is going to be dropping some of these links in the chat so that they're easily accessible to you. I want to just highlight and pull out 2 of the things from our election resources. We have a non-manipulative voting guide that can help you and your community discuss and decide how you will vote this November. This includes 5 questions Christians should ask themselves before they vote. We also have a short video that you can share with your communities and congregations this fall. We believe that public leadership will be required after the election as much as it is required now. And so we'd ask that you join us in sharing this video and committing to be a trusted presence in your community after the election. And then just 2 last things. One of the core programs at CCPL is our Public Life Fellowship program. And today is actually the last day to apply for next year's 2025 Public Life Fellowship. So if you are a Christian with demonstrated commitment to public service and the public good, and are exploring these questions around how your faith intersects with your public life, please consider applying. And finally, a few weeks ago, we hosted our 2024 Summit for the Good of the Public. And registration for our 2025 Summit is already open, so you can get your tickets now and be part of the conversation around the future of faith in America. We're so grateful, Julia, for you and for Coco and Ben and all of the members of your team, and the opportunity to collaborate with the great work that More in Common is doing. And looking forward to much, much future collaboration and work ahead. I'll pass it back off to you all to conclude the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phoebe. We'll just conclude with a few more thanks. Just deeply grateful, as we mentioned, to CCPL for their kind of thought partnership throughout this project, and for all of the panelists today for their just immense wisdom that you shared. I learned so much, and I'm feeling so much more kind of hopeful and inspired during a week as the election approached that's been feeling really heavy. So just thank you so much for everything you shared today. And for those on the call, just to remind you that we are here as a resource for you. I think I can speak to CCPL. If there's anything that we can do or CCPL can do to help support the important work that you're doing, please shoot us an email. Really happy to explore opportunities for collaboration. Ben dropped a feedback survey in the chat, so if you could just take 2 minutes to fill that out, we'd be eternally grateful. And otherwise, we hope you all have a wonderful week, and just thank you for your time today. Wonderful.